If we don't understand the Quran, we cannot act upon the Quran. The recitation of the Quran is so that you encounter the meanings of the Quran. You encounter the meanings of the Quran so that you can process and understand them. And you understand them so that you can follow them. In and of itself, recitation is not the end goal, but it's a starting point for getting somewhere. And when a young child completes their reading of the Quran in Arabic, we celebrate them. I'm waiting for the day when there will be an expectation that you will read the Quran from cover to cover in English. And we will celebrate that. And we will set that as a norm. The Quran is giving guidelines about money. It's telling the Muslims about how they should handle themselves. Surah Al-Baqarah is emblematic of this. In the beginning of the surah, money should be used towards a higher purpose, which is freedom. And freedom is one of the great principles upon which the Islamic society must be built.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. With me, I have a very special guest today. I'm in Scotland, Bonnie, Scotland, and today's guest is Sheikh Dr Sohaib Saeed, and he's a scholar in Quranic studies with a unique academic background both in philosophy and also Islamic theology. He's a graduate at the prestigious Al-Azhar University in Cairo and completed his PhD at SOAS under the renowned translator Abdul Halim. And his forthcoming book, Explaining the Quran Through the Quran, is set to be published by Edinburgh University Press. Dr. Sohaib is widely recognized for his translations of classical tafsīr works, with the first volume of the great exegesis by Imam Razi earning the prestigious Sheikh Hamad Award for translation. He has contributed to various academic journals as well, advised on Quranic projects at Bayyinah Institute, and currently oversees content at Quran.com and Quran Reflect. His work bridges academic scholarship with innovative educational initiatives, bringing the Quran to life through events, films, and recitation projects. Sheikh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Ibrahim. Good to meet you.
And actually, this is, it's fascinating stuff to read, all the different ways that you've been involved with the Quran. I'm intrigued because I was at this build-a-thon recently where these young brothers, they were working on a project, allows you to see the different tones of your recitation. And so you can literally see in like a tech format how close you are to Mishari al-Afasi, or you can choose a reciter and try and get close to him as possible. Before we get into the financy stuff and how the Quran relates to that, I'd love to get your insights on how we can, and this was their attempt, their attempt to make the Quran a lot more accessible and try and get over the hump of I'm a bit embarrassed to read the Quran in public. How can we make the Quran more engaging for people?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and it's actually my main preoccupation. Much as I love the academic stuff, and I wish I could just hide away with the books, there is this tremendous sense of responsibility you have when you perhaps pursue a path of study, you attain something, to then think about, okay, but what is the real life application of this? Because we can't really have that luxury in the ivory towers in which you are pursuing higher levels of research, unless you are at least sure that you have done what you can to help get the essential meanings out to people. So that's why I'm really privileged that I have a very constructive relationship with the likes of Quran.com, one which inshallah will have its first flowers blooming in the next year or so. The site itself goes back more than 15 years, nearly 20 years that it's been out there, and I was using it, even before pursuing any serious Islamic studies. And now we have a way of charting forward progress and outreach. And the main thing that we need to emphasize here is getting people to pick up the Quran, to read it. If that means in a physical book, then great. More and more, of course, it is these other devices that are important, that people are focusing their eyes on them. So we need to think about how to get these to be a window onto what is important. So this year we created a new project, and really it needs to be sort of ramped up for the next year. It's called the Global Quranic Calendar. So the idea here stemmed from a couple of sad realities. Number one, people don't tend to have much of a cultural practice of reading translations of the Quran. So if we're talking about people who understand Arabic and can read Arabic and can appreciate the Quran in its original language, they have a big head start, right? But then so many of us, and indeed the majority of people in the world, don't speak Arabic. Majority of Muslims don't speak Arabic. So we have a big blessing in the form of translations of the Quran. Some of them can be better than others, but every language just about has got a workable Quran translation. Some of them have literally too many. English has too many translations. We have some emphasis on the aspect of recitation. We celebrate that to some extent. We attach all the hadiths to that meaning. We have competitions about it. And we just have a basic cultural imperative that, read Quran. Friday comes, read Surah Al-Kahf. And we mean, read it in Arabic. And when a young child completes their reading of the Quran in Arabic, we celebrate them. I'm waiting for the day when there will be an expectation that you will read the Quran from cover to cover in English. And we will celebrate that. And we will set that as a norm. So in the absence of that, we needed to think about not just providing the translations, because as I said, there are so many. Quran.com has in English, more than 15 at the moment just there. And there are other sites with more. Quantity is not the issue. The issue is the cultural norm. So the global Quranic calendar sets out to solve this. And the calendar part is because of the other thing. Ramadan is the month of the Quran. Ramadan comes, we all get into action. We have our personal preferences about how we spend that time, and then we have a discussion around, is it more about quality or about quantity? And, you can have both. I always veer on the side of quality over quantity. But okay, Ramadan could be that month of quantity. I want to complete a khatma of the Quran. I want to read it from cover to cover. And always this is in what? In Arabic. Right? Because we have so much discourse around how this is what it means to read the Quran, and little discourse about what is missing and what is in fact fundamental in our engagement with the Quran, which is understanding it. If we don't understand the Quran, we cannot act upon the Quran. Everything falls within, a scheme of purposes. The recitation of the Quran is so that you encounter the meanings of the Quran. You encounter the meanings of the Quran so that you can process and understand them. And you understand them so that you can follow them. In and of itself, recitation is not the end goal, but it's a starting point for getting somewhere. If we are talking about people who don't speak Arabic, then that chain is actually broken, and we need to find another way to the core purpose. We can still do the recitation. We should, right? We can still emphasize that plenty. People get very scared now. Oh, you're trying to take away, Arabic recitation, or you're denying the blessings. I'm not denying anything. I'm not attacking anything. I'm just saying, hello, could we have a conversation about the main purpose of why the Quran was revealed, which is for us to follow it? And how is your practices leading to that outcome? How will it help us, with all due respect, that you know which maqam you're reciting in, right? That's nice. It's fun. I was smiling. I was thinking, oh, that'd be fun, right? But it won't get me to living the Quran. So we have a conceptual problem a lot of the time, right? So the calendar thing is about saying, okay, Ramadan is the month of the Quran. You know what? Let's not worry about Ramadan right now. People have taken care of Ramadan. But what about Shawwal and the other months between the Ramadans? We've got here 11 months, 46 weeks. So what we did through Quran.com is we just thought about a new way of apportioning the Quran into 46 parts. So we have traditionally 30 parts. The 30 parts were there because obviously that's to read the Quran in 30 days, not 30 weeks, in 30 days, because the expectation was you want to read it in 30 days, every 30 days, not just Ramadan. But, if we're not at that level, we can read it at a slower pace. Okay. So why not make that pace essentially a year between Ramadans, from Shawwal to Sha'ban? So we made 46 weekly readings. And then we are just inviting everyone each week, just read this weekly reading in a language you understand. If that's Arabic, then perfect. If it's English, we're actually going to give you a PDF with that English translation. We take Professor Abdul Halim's, my supervisor, and just slightly represent it and package that out to people as a weekly reading. Just in A4, like 4 or 5 pages of text, very easy to read in the course of a week. And if you want to read it with the Arabic as well, that's perfectly fine. But I'm not going to push you to do that, because I've noticed that this becomes an obstacle for people. Those who struggle with the pronunciation of Arabic, they get intimidated by the Quran. They find it's a difficult thing to read the Quran, because that's what they were told. That is the be-all and end-all of reading the Quran, is to pronounce it with tajweed and to observe the rules and the lengthenings and the gunnas and the and the right? Which is great. I'm a tajweed teacher. I have ijazah in tajweed. I say that just so that people don't attack me like, oh, you're anti-tajweed. In a way, I've come to a realization and a little bit of repentance from overemphasis of certain things. someone comes in to read the Quran and the first thing you do is scare them that even your a'udhu billah, you have to seek refuge in Allah from that, right? Not from the shaitan, but from your pronunciation. I don't even let you say Bismillah. You didn't get there because your is not right and your o is not right and your dhu is not right. So this, it's just scaring people, right? So I think people have, and this requires, to be honest, research and surveys and focus groups and whatever. Inshallah, I hope that we get around to doing some serious research in this. But people have all sorts of things that have intimidated them concerning the Quran. And then when they do get to reading it, they might encounter things that surprise them, they weren't ready for, they didn't know were in the Quran, they didn't know how to understand, things that raise questions. And this, by the way, is I think what lies behind a certain anti-translation discourse that exists in our community. Now, I wouldn't believe this except that a number of people, numerous people have told me that they heard some imam or sheikh or speaker or whatever saying this. They would tell them, no, don't read a translation of the Quran because you'll be misguided. So you might think, oh, they're going to tell you to read tafsīr instead. Oh, definitely don't read tafsīr.
Oh, really?
What should you do? Come to me, I'll tell you. Essentially, this sort of clerical class, which, if the scholars themselves were really doing what it takes to explain the Quran to people, that might not actually be such a bad thing. Yeah. But as it is, the scholars themselves have turned away from a focus on the Quran and tafsir. They're not centering that in their discourse. They themselves really need to pursue higher levels of study than what typically gets done in our madrasas, darul ulooms, seminaries, even universities. So I think that they are a little bit scared about what questions will come because they're not equipped to answer those questions. So what we're trying to do, the team of scholars who are working together on these projects like Quran.com, along with all the tech people and the designers and the engineers and the marketers and all sorts of amazing people, what we're trying to do is to lift the intimidation, to open up the Quran to people, and then face the challenges that come from that, right? Because as we're going through, of course we have to explain certain things. I myself, during this year, as we've been putting out these weekly readings, we also record a weekly podcast. It's called the Divine Book Club. In the Divine Book Club, we have a group of young people. We just read the weekly reading in English and share a few thoughts here and there, right? Just to kind of model for people that, that's how easy reading the Quran is. You might want a little bit more background information. You might need to clarify something. But also you can be okay with not everything being super clear all at once. Like in the first place, you want to get the overall picture. What is the Quran actually talking about? What is important in there? What are the things that Revelation prioritizes? What are the things that it talks about explicitly? What are some things that maybe are alluded to and less focused on? And how does this align with our perspective of religion that we have grown up with culturally? So encountering it is itself like a bit of an event. So this year, there are, I don't know how many people, but plenty of people have been following along and encountering the Quran in this way for the first time. I myself, honestly, Ibrahim, this year, I'm reading the Quran in a way that I didn't read it before. Yes, I am looking at books of tafsir while I'm preparing, but mainly I'm looking at, the flow of the text more quickly in a way that made me see the Quran in a different way from when I am doing granular micro study of particular ayahs and what the scholars said about it. I'm now starting to see, the beginning of this surah corresponds to the ending of the next surah. There's like an overarching connection between what was said there and how that worked itself out to the end. So I started to appreciate things that I didn't get through my studies per se. I just want this for every Muslim. I think every Muslim should be able to read the Quran. Do I even want to just say once in their life in their own language? But let's say that people get...
Once a year.
Let's say they get hooked. Keep doing it, Do it this first year. Do it again next year. Do it again the year after. And our idea is we actually want to then provide some sense of levels, right? So level 1 is what I've just described to you. Really just don't have to go into any details, footnotes, bare minimum footnotes. Sometimes we feel, you really might not understand this piece of the translation, or you might need some context, without which you could get the wrong idea from the translation. So we put very, very minimal footnotes. But after doing that, I'm hoping that people will say, what next? I really like that, but now I want to actually go a little bit deeper. So we say, okay, let's do level 2, the same pace, but just a little bit more detail. Level 3, maybe we can start to introduce Arabic vocabulary, right? So you can start to encounter the words in Arabic and learn some Arabic, through your engagement with the Quran. And this is, in a way, inverting that we have set up in this country, among others. And people tell me it's much the same in lots of countries, where we have got young people. We want to ensure that we preserve their religion, their identity. We figured out that we can do some after-school classes or Sunday schools. If you were thinking from first principles, what do you cover in this precious time in which you are trying to form the identity of the young people? Well, people made the decision that the thing we should cover is pronouncing the Arabic Quran out loud. And I think that's a very questionable decision. And I would love to see the working done around that and the things that were excluded and why they were excluded. I'd like to see the list of possible things that we could cover in our after schools and why we ended up with this one. Not because I want to attack that one. I want to ask, why not that? And why not that? For example, why not give them a basic understanding of the surahs of the Quran? It doesn't have to be all based around the Quran either, despite, my bias towards Quranic studies. Where is seerah, where is akhlaq and morals and ethics, hadith and basic fiqh and, what you need. Okay, there are, I'm sure, some madrasas and so on that are covering all these bases. But as you know, there are many that really don't cover these bases and they don't have any qualms about that. They find that perfectly normal because I call generational trauma. Yeah. Essentially, that's what was done before us.
There's an interesting project that my brother-in-law started in the Heritage Centre in Manchester. They're doing a hifz program, but they are telling the kids that they have to learn the vocabulary, like the top 100 words, 1,000 words, or whatever it is. And every week they get tested on that. So the idea is that then they're tested when they give they read their sabak. They're tested on the meaning, like not word by word, just the gist of it initially. And then there's on the weekends, on the Sundays, they have a morning session where they have, I think, pizza at the end of it or something like that as well, where it's a bit more about tadabbur and it's a bit more about, getting them into the habit of the morning adhkar. And it's a very early stage project. I mean, they've just started it. It's been a few months. But I think that could be, it's exciting. It's interesting to see how that develops because I feel like that will end up creating a much better relationship for those kids anyway with the Quran than, just the kind of rote memorization that, historically a lot of our madaris have taught. But I wanted to ask you, Sheikh, because our audience, they've turned up, to IFG because of the whole financial side of things. Sure. And there is a link, right, between the Quran and day-to-day life and how, transactions and muamalat and our, careers and everything plays out. What is that link? And how is the normal discourse that we're having on, this channel and as people in business, how is the Quran important and how should it be fitting into our lives?
Well, you can look at the Quran and the moment of Quranic revelation, the event of the revelation and of the prophethood, the mission of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the transformation of the Arabs into the Muslim Ummah, the influence they had. You can look at it through different lenses. There are some who have looked at it through a somewhat economic lens, maybe a kind of Marxist analysis or something. And I'm not necessarily saying let's do that, but I'm saying money makes the world go round, as people say. Of course, we know Allah makes the world go round, but the fact is, it's one of the extremely important dimensions of human life that underpins a lot of what happens, even if it is not being made explicit, exactly why it's important. So Quraysh, for example, are objecting to La ilaha illallah, and they're objecting for all sorts of reasons, but we don't have to restrict our analysis here to the purely theological objection. It's because it would have real life implications for them, right? Following this leader, abandoning their idols. It was also abandoning the very lucrative Hajj trade, handing it over to the custodianship of the Prophet ﷺ, who had the rightful leadership of the Kaaba. And before that, a lot of what the Quran is telling us about, and it's in the backdrop of it all, is how Quraysh have established themselves in a certain position that they didn't want to give up. They consider themselves to be the inheritors of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so often people don't notice this, but there's more than one pseudo-Abrahamic religion. I know people don't like the word Abrahamic religion. Sometimes what we mean is those religions that claim their heritage from Ibrahim alayhi salam. So it wasn't just the Jews and the Christians, but the mushrikun as well were another pseudo-Abrahamic faith. They were running the pilgrimage. They made lots of money from people coming to see their idols, by which they had, filled the Kaaba. It's a big implication. The financial implication is a big one. It is the dunyawi reason for resistance. In Medina, Abdullah ibn Ubay wanted to be the leader. Is it just because of enjoying leadership? Well, leadership comes with other things, right? So what I'm saying is we can start to see how important money, whether it's in the hands of the righteous or in the hands of the wicked, affects the decisions and the movements and the conflicts. Much of the conflict nowadays is underpinned by, obviously, trying to gain resources, gain access to the resources, gain exclusive pipelines of oil and things which also make the world go round. Hatta hin, until it runs out. The Quran is giving guidelines about money. It's telling the Muslims about how they should handle themselves. Surah Al-Baqarah is emblematic of this. In the beginning of the surah, there is a lot about those previous communities and how they have failed in their, in living up to what they were supposed to do. And then there's a kind of shift around ayah 177, the ayah of bir. لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ. It tells us about the great principles of righteousness from an Islamic point of view. That involves spending on all sorts of good causes. Some of them are clearly charitable causes, right? So, وَالْمَسَاكِينَ, people who are poor. But some of it is more like, you give to your relatives. You should use money to promote good feeling, connection, family solidarity. This is one of the principles. وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, also to free prisoners or to free slaves. Here again, it's pointing to the fact that money should be used towards a higher purpose, which is freedom. And freedom is one of the great principles upon which the Islamic society must be built. So then Allah Azza wa Jal starts to tell us about other rulings about qisas and retaliation in cases of murder. Then talks about the bequest. What do we do at the point of death? How do we pass our money on safely and securely to the next generation? And in these ayat, there is an indication that you are supposed to have a sense of ma'roof, a sense of what is fair and just and what does good to your relatives and to those who are deserving. If others can see that there is some injustice in what you have done, they can fix it. Right? So there's a principle here, which then is followed up in Surah An-Nisa with all the ayat about inheritance, where it gets more specific and granular. And then in Surah Al-Baqarah, we have got various other things pertaining to wealth. We have the ayat which are talking about giving in the way of Allah. The subtext of that, I think people might not always notice, is that the Muslims now are in conflict, are at war, and there is a need to support that effort. It's not just about giving to people who are struggling individually, but it's about contributing to the cause, right? So the higher purposes of the ummah is not always, of course, in fighting, right? Unfortunately, we're not yet in a world free of war. It's extremely unfortunate. The revelation is very realistic about the fact that this is a need, right? To support those who are striving on the front lines in the way of God, to establish justice, to fight oppression. And then giving in the way of Allah, how this is multiplied, contrasted with the practices of that time, of riba, of usury. And there is a very, very powerful expression that we always hear about then be aware of the announcement of war from God and His Messenger. I think it is important to connect that with some of the context, some of the background, some of the history, to see that in the first place, the ones who are being directly chastised here are those who are eating, literally eating, or taking, consuming usury. Because usury is a practice of oppression. It is used against the weak, the vulnerable, even if it starts off, how a loan shark or someone might start off with saying nice things, and then it turns very bitter and violent even later on, right? So it's a system in which people are kind of pushed towards taking on debt, something which the Prophet ﷺ would seek refuge in being in debt to people, right? But taking on debt that they don't need, or that they need, but Islam is calling on us to do that in a charitable way, not just to hand over money, but to lend money in a charitable way, that's say without expecting anything additional in return, just a return of what I had lent. So this is part of the solidarity. Then there was a tribe called Thaqif who tried to bring their own conditions. They said, we will join the Muslims and will fall under your, system of governance, except that we are going to continue to claim any riba that's owed to us, and also we're going to not pay any riba that we owe. I hope that's okay. So they almost were going to get away with this until the ayah came to tell them that they must give up what remains of the riba. And if you don't do that, then hear that you are at war with Allah and His Messenger. The thing is that sometimes when we read the Quran and we're not conscious of the background and what kind of people were being spoken to in the first place at the time of revelation, we may then think, okay, if someone takes out a small loan and it's got riba, then they are at war with Allah and His Messenger. And I think that, taking the seriousness of the ayat is good. That's from taqwa. To say, I want to stay far away from riba altogether. But, we shouldn't turn that also into a sort of condemnation thing of each other. Because the emphasis in these ayat is not on the vulnerable ones who are taking out the ribawi loans. The focus is on those who administer them, those who
consuming it,
who consume the riba, who are making profit out of these loans. Of course, there are people who take ribawi loans in order to profit as well, and that is also condemned. In the first place, the issue of loans, charitable type loans, is supposed to be based on the principle of need. You don't need to take more with the riba attached in order to have more profit and to build up a business. That's the kind of backdrop of those things. And as we know, also the longest ayah in the whole Quran, not just in Surah Al-Baqarah, is the ayah of writing down debts, ayah 282. And you could take that as a kind of sign of the fact that sometimes the Quran goes into such detail on certain matters that highlights its importance, which we might otherwise have thought, well, you could mention briefly, quickly, that writing down debts is a good thing. But here, a full page is taken up of the particularities of that. And this could point to the fact that, we have to be very scrupulous. We have to be very careful. We have to be very respectful of each other to avoid causing harm to others, right, in any way. And avoid putting ourselves in the position also of exposing ourselves to harm.
It's really interesting that you're pointing to the story of how this verse was revealed around the fact that Nabi Habri min Allah wa Rasuli. And you do hear this a lot, as you said, right, Sheikh, where riba is associated with this. But actually what you're saying here is that this particular tribe, I just wanted to double click on that, they were saying that they're going to take the riba, but they're not going to pay back the interest. So they're kind of taking advantage of the prohibition in some sense.
They're kind of trying to set some terms on joining the Muslim community. And so a very firm thing is said to them that you will not join on these terms. Although we know that when the Prophet ﷺ was welcoming in different tribes from far reaches as well, sometimes there would be, as you know, in the categories of zakat, mu'allafatu qulubuhum, there was even things that could be allocated from the zakat to encourage and sweeten the deal for certain people. But this was too much. This was something which directly goes against a principle of fairness, and the riba had to be wiped out at this point. There was no chance for anyone to come in and say, well, we'll get a superior deal. Like the people in the Ayat al-Qasas, verse 178, some of the narrations around that are telling us that there would be certain tribes who would say, if one of our lot kills one of your lot, we're not going to give up the actual killer. We'll pay some blood money, right? We'll give you some dates. But if one of yours kills ours, we will not just kill the killer, we'll kill 10 others, right? So there was this imbalance. And one of the things that these ayat in Surah Al-Baqarah are altogether addressing is this oppression, this double standard, this attempt to play the system and to hold on to the jahili power structures. Whereas now Islam is, again, I don't want to provide a Marxist analysis of things, but in so many ways flattening the structure, right? There's fairness, there's equality. And yes, some can have more than others, but it won't be on the basis of exploiting and being able to use the fact that you already have more to be able to amass even more and more and more. And we know that, a lot of people say there's no such thing as a good billionaire. I don't know, maybe there is. But in order to become a billionaire, you had to have done certain things. And even if you didn't know you were doing it, someone was doing it on your behalf to get to that point. So the extreme, gap between rich and poor is indicative of oppressive structures. So this thaqif, we're not going to get away with that. And they're told, well, you either join the Muslims on the terms that are set for you, or in fact you are our enemies. Anyway, spoiler alert. They accepted the terms. They accepted the terms and did the right thing. Yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned the whole Marxist aspect of it, and I'm intrigued about how someone who's spent time with the Quran, where you think, on the spectrum of capitalism, socialism, where does Islam fall? You've got verses like لِكَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ, and you've got all of this, sadaqah and zakah, and where the allocations are supposed to be going. You've got the Prophet ﷺ who said that, Allahu al-Musa'ir, Allah is the price giver. How, as someone who's spent a lot more time, with the nusus, what's your sense of, on the spectrum, is even the correct spectrum, capitalism versus socialism, where does Islam land?
Well, I think you alluded to the answer by saying it's not the right spectrum. I mean, there's so much danger, of course, in trying to make Islam fit in on some other spectrum. As a thought experiment, it can be okay. I think there are different ways to take the collection of things in the Quran and of course from the Sunnah all together and analyze them. I think that also depends upon the time in which you live. So there might have been ways of looking at it in previous times. The same thing applies to, peace and war, right? So a lot of the direct speech of the Quran and of course from the seerah and so on is very dependent upon what the world was like at that time and the norms and so on, which have changed to some extent. Although I feel, to be honest, embarrassed to say it, with United Nations and so on, but I feel like the world order is perhaps shifting back to the wildness from which it came, because if the UN is completely powerless to stop an active genocide that is broadcast on our screens, it does call into question what I would like to say, based on some scholars that I admire, that okay, but now we're in a state of global peace, essentially, right? That's the default situation, is peace. So we don't have to analyze things as if we were in that kind of world where the default is, assertion of power, and you have to fight or be fought. You have to, kill or be killed, right? So I think that is actually something that is sensitive to time. And that's, part of how I see the issue of studying the Quran, is that it does have to move with the times. There will always be an importance in analyzing things in their historical context. So I don't want to then take away the possibility that there's a relevance of this word, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. I just want us to first place it where it came from and what it was doing at the time that it was revealed, and then extend from that to wherever it seems sensible to extend it, right? We might say this is a kind of a division between tafsīr and tadabbur, right? So explaining the text, the exegesis, the interpretation, and then reflecting on the text. Or we might call this second thing ta'wil also, right? That we can say it has applications, it has implications, which can be extended from the text into different scenarios.
And how does that link to, where does fiqh, do you think, fit into this? And do you think that, there's this whole debate sometimes that crops up, which is that, what is the meaning of riba? And the financial world has become so much more complex than where, the Quran was originally revealed. Today we've got all these weird and wonderful things going on, and even the nature of money has completely changed. And so there's an argument put forward by certain folks that, look, you need to understand riba in a certain way. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we should understand it. But then also, how does that then at a certain point translate into the hard kind of rulings, hukums of fiqh for today? how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up fiqh, because this is where I can say, well, I'm not a fiqh person. And I think that when you ask certain questions, it becomes a kind of matter of fatwa. It's more serious than just saying, okay, let's think about the Quran. Although that's an essential element to it. But fiqh or fatwa depends upon a whole matrix of things. So, I was just revising what Sheikh Ibn Ashur has said about ayatul riba, and he talks about, the three main categories that they have identified for riba, which is riba al-jahiliyyah, riba al-fadl, and riba al-nasi'ah. So he says that the ayat are addressing riba al-jahiliyyah. That's the context, that's the specific thing. That is to say, charging a payment for late return of a debt. Knowing that doesn't then give you the full answer, because then there are ahadith that are pertinent to the subject. And fiqh is always going to take in, as we say, the waqi', the situation, the lived context, which is always shifting. And so does tafsīr in a certain way. Oftentimes, I'm asked about scientific tafsīr ilmi, for example. And I always say, everybody will interpret the Quran in the time that they are, based on the knowledge that humanity has reached by that point. So Imam al-Razi, who I translated some of his surahs, is living in the 12th and 13th century miladi, CE, and he's talking about certain scientific things based on his time. And obviously when we read him, we have to understand that, okay, yeah, that's based on what you knew. They knew a lot, but things have obviously changed a lot. Ibn Ashur, who I work more on these days, he is in the 20th century. It's already a little bit out of date, right? Some of the things he has. But he's also giving explanation of things in light of the current knowledge. This is tafsīr ilmi, not just in the scientific thing, but that would apply to everything else. That would apply to what we understand about money and how it works. How do the same things apply to, before we even get to cryptocurrency, just currency? Like, it's not even currency anymore. It's not fiat currency, you call it, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even the thing that they were talking about then, when they're talking about exchanging dates or exchanging gold. And you need, of course, people to bring together different types of expertise. I think this is one of the crucial things really to emphasize in these days that we are in. And this, this was always a good idea, but especially now. The days of the polymath are done, right? Nobody's Imam al-Razi and has like all the knowledge that we currently have. Yeah, I know you have ChatGPT. It's not the same thing, right? So we need to have very constructive and well-constructed conversations between people who bring the different things to the table. I think a lot of people say that, but not very often does it happen. So those who are going to talk about Quran and tafsir and fiqh have to ensure that they bring into the room those who have the knowledge, for example, of finance and commerce and all the new things that we are dealing with. But on the flip side, oftentimes I think certain things are treated as easy, like reinterpreting the Quran could be easy. And even the specific scholars that we bring into the conversation might be fiqh scholars. So even here, we need more than that. We need the fiqh scholars. We also need the tafsir scholars.
That's the archaeologists.
I'm trying to defend my field here and
good.
Say that we have a place, actually, people involved in tafsir. Whereas even many Muslim scholars and graduates and so on don't appreciate that, because they did very minimal tafsir. So they don't appreciate there's actually a lot more to that part of it, just like I hopefully do appreciate that there's a lot more to the fiqh, which is why I very comfortably raise my hands when someone asks me a question, say, ask somebody else, right? But in tafsir also, sometimes people ought to say, ask somebody else.
Fascinating. So it's, in a way, I've not, to be honest, looked at his book for a long time, but Dr. Tariq Ramadan, he had this idea, right, of where in modernity we need to have this congregation of practitioners and scholars of different hues and colours to come together and give fatwa, or come together and come to some kind of guidance to move forward, which I think is fascinating. And you could argue that, as you've just done, it's more needed now than ever before, because actually the nature of shifts and the nature of data creation and information has accelerated. You've got that, what's it called, the curve, where it's kind of exponential, and microchips are getting smaller, smaller and smaller and more powerful, and so the sheer velocity of change has actually materially shifted into the next gear. And so the old modes of understanding and applying need to change effectively. And
here I could shift into a little bit around this project called QuranReflect.com. So it's a sister site or a sub-site of Quran.com. And it was actually created for this purpose of, I may say, democratizing reflection on the Quran. People do get very scared here as well. What's going to happen if people say things that are wrong? Well, we have a safety net in there. We have safeguards. We have a review team. We have scholars who moderate the reflections. And that's actually part of empowering people, is to say, don't worry too much about making the mistake, but try to say something sensible and right and useful and informative, or at least personal and thoughtful about the ayah that somebody else might like to read and benefit from. Not necessarily as knowledge, but as something that inspires them to look at the ayah in a particular way and see something there that you saw. Like if I say, this ayah really frightened me for the following reason, someone might say, subhanAllah, I didn't notice that aspect of the ayah. So let me tell you that from the perspective of a tafsīr scholar, I am often reading things from the general public that I'm like, wow, how did you see that? Right? Because they are not restricted to the technical tools, but they just come to it with seeking hearts, right? But also, Ibrahim, the important thing is they come to it with different types of expertise as well. So you'll have people who are doctors, neuroscientists, or people who are economists, or people who work in retail or on a farm, or whatever it may be. And each of them sees certain things in the ayat that someone with, we all have our own limited experience. I can't know what it's like to see the Quran through all these different eyes until people are encouraged to come and share their perspectives. And that then collectively allows us to see the Quran more for what it is and all the different things that it applies to and that it means. I mean, the technical, academic side of this is as if to say tafsīr mawdu'i, that's like thematic exegesis. You can look at the Quran from different perspectives. You could do an economic reading of the Quran and sort of go from start to finish and try to analyze it from that perspective. And you might see the relevance of certain things that are not obviously economic, right? I mean, one of the scholars gave this example. تَبَّتْ يَدَا أَبِي لَهَبٍ وَتَبٍّ مَا أَغْنَى عَنْهُ مَالُهُ وَمَا كَسَبٍ. He said that the scholars have inferred from this that even the kafir's money belongs to him, right? أَغْنَى عَنْهُ مَالُهُ. It says maluhu, so Allah is affirming that is his mal. Now that might be an important point someday, right? Yeah. Or you might extract it from other places as well. But even things that are not necessarily on the topic of money can be seen through that lens. So that also is very useful if people can get to some kind of specialism and then combine it with some guidance as to how to read the Quran, some tafsīrs that give you a sort of safe, basic explanation so you know where you are, what's the background of the ayah. And then you can sort of start on the reflecting, while being careful, of course, not to be too authoritative in your statements about the Quran. I always look at it this way, anything that you say, you just have to be able to back up what you say and have evidence for it, right? And don't say things above your pay grade. So if a person says, this makes me think about, well, no one can deny that it made you think about that. But if you say, Allah here meant to do this, well, hold on.
Yeah.
You need to be pretty sure. Yeah. You need to be sure about what you're saying now.
So it's really, this is a very interesting thread, because there are certain aspects of life that all of us are semi kind of, familiar with, like childbirth and, fatherhood, motherhood, etc. But then there are certain relatively complex areas that will often touch on science or some kind of technical field like finance or something like that. And there's been so much progress in those fields. I think what we're kind of alluding to in this conversation, that you need, the فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, you need to kind of have some experts in the room to help with that. I guess what I'm getting at is the man in Arabia 1500 years ago, when he understood the Quran, he was looking at it from a financial lens, for example, let's say. He understood it in a certain way, and you've now got all this layer upon layer of complexity that, even to apply it to a modern bank account, or to apply the Quran to a drug that has, I don't know, some kind of pork gelatin or something, you need to have some level of interface with an expert. How should we, as individuals who are non-experts in everything, how should we try and navigate this when we hit one of these bumps in the Quran road where it's like, whoa, I actually don't really know what to do here?
I think that's very difficult because this is an institutional question for me. I liked what you were raising earlier about kind of fiqh councils and collective ijtihad, and there are such bodies that exist but maybe haven't flowered how we could have hoped. To look at these questions at a community level, we appoint the best among us to research the matters, and then we can then collectively say we have some trust in the pronouncements of this body, and I am not sure that there's the right people to point to in this. It's not beyond possibility. Short of that, we have our individual responsibility. I think a great deal of what, in fact, the Quranic revelation inculcates is a sense of conscience, values. There is the technical aspects of halal and haram, and then there's the spiritual dimension, pleasing Allah, staying within His boundaries, sometimes giving up things which could be permissible just out of the doubt that is attached to them. These are overarching values. The fiqh councils shouldn't be pronouncing based on these spiritual matters so much as they have to provide clarity on exactly where we stand, right? But then a person can say, look, even if there's a fatwa that permits this, I'm not at ease with it. I mean, from the hadith that, there is something that's considered sinful that it just itches inside you and you're not at ease with it, even if you get the fatwa over and over again that it's okay. So that doesn't mean you now are fit to pronounce that it's haram. It just means you, at the end of the day, are going to answer for yourself as to the process by which you decided to do what you do. And if you felt uneasy and that maybe this is displeasing to Allah and you give it up for His sake, then you would be rewarded for that, even if in reality it would have been acceptable to take it. So I think that a lot of people do make decisions on this basis. One of the big ones is around taking out mortgages versus renting, and right, there are people
difficult in Scotland, I hear.
In the sense of the products that are
because
available.
One of the options is not even on the table anymore.
Right. But I understand that maybe some of them are starting to look north of the border now. Yeah.
This is even though I'm the guy in investments and finance, I'm actually hearing it from Sheikh Sohaib first.
Yeah. Can we name products?
Why not?
So Faida.
Yeah.
They did say that they have financed at least one house north of the border. So
in Scotland,
that at least indicates that they can do it. Yeah, there is more restriction here, so people can decide just really what will I feel comfortable going back to Allah with. But what you want, of course, is for responsible bodies to give clear information about it. I mean, I get so many people coming and asking me, and I don't feel competent to tell them. I might feel competent to make my own personal decision for me and my family, but I don't feel that I want to tell lots of people about what they should do.
It's a very tricky one, isn't it? In a way, I feel like having come to Scotland on this particular subject, it's because I've obviously got this question as well in every conversation we've had. It's often actually it's a harder question to answer here than in the UK, because in the my view is that I'm quite comfortable with a lot of the Islamic home financing products out there. So in the UK, where there are these options, it's quite easy to say use these products, and that's that. But where there isn't really that optionality here, you're actually then back into the the Sheikh Qardawi landscape, where you're potentially allowing a conventional
take
mortgage.
The excuse for So it upsets me a lot, Ibrahim, to be honest, seeing how backward we are in a lot of things, and this is one of those. I'm glad to see the steps forward. I just feel like this is at least 20, 30 years later than it should have been, at least.
Yeah.
I just don't see why we couldn't have got here faster in practical terms. But, wherever we get to, let's keep pushing forward. I think with so many things, we are slow on the uptake. And this was a kind of emergency issue, I would say. It affects everyone in some way. And as you know, our resources as a Muslim community are not that sparse. We have resources. We are just not utilizing them, directing them towards, if we were to solve our own financial situation, I think we'd be a very different community, let alone can we start thinking about providing a solution for others?
Yeah.
Because if this is one of our civilizational values, the war against riba, and where are we in sharing that with other people? The question of, what value do Muslims bring to, it upsets me that that's a question.
Yeah.
And the blame for that, I'm sorry, I don't want to look anywhere else than ourselves. Yes, there are Islamophobic forces and so on who have their reasons and agendas to do what they do. But we shouldn't have made it possible for anyone to question what do Muslims do. We can and should have by now been much, much further ahead in what we offer to this country and others like it. We shouldn't have been the ones selling the alcohol. We should have been the ones leading the way in a cultural shift from alcohol. We have been insular.
Yeah.
Sorry to be depressing about it.
No, I completely agree. But I feel like we're changing. I feel like there's this movement, or there's this feeling in the air with the Muslim community where we're now slowly cranking through the gears and hopefully getting to the point where we're much more outward looking. And I agree. I kind of sometimes get frustrated, and this may sound odd given, I'm a trustee of the Islamophobia response unit, is that I actually don't think we should be victims or thinking of ourselves as victims. That's not really how, if the Prophet was here today, he wouldn't be probably campaigning on Islamophobia. I don't want to, obviously create a hypothetical, but, if we look at the Quran, it would be about da'wah. It would be about, what's the proactive, positive message of trying to create an environment or a society.
So it's the difference between seeing yourselves as a minority that needs to survive, or people carrying the banner of the prophethood.
Yeah, or the guy, right? Or the وَجَاءَ رَجُلٌ مِّنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْعَى, being that guy,
running from the outskirts, bringing an urgent message. That's the key word, really, urgent. This is urgent. I'm glad that things are moving. We need to make more urgent strides in it. We need to support each other. I think that's a much more positive spirit these days. There are people still on what used to be called Twitter who think that debating over Allah's attributes is a suitable use of time. But I think most people have moved on from that and are thinking about, okay, we have observed a lot, learned a lot, been hurt a lot by recent events, how this genocide in Palestine has played out, and the things that we might have thought would make a difference didn't. The urgent question now is, what next? For the immediate situation, but for whatever the next situations are going to be as well. For the people of Palestine, but this is not something limited to the locale in which the bombs are falling. It's, that people are talking about the party systems now, what to do in the US elections, don't want to interfere in their election. Obviously I have a big sway over there. But people, I think, need to be asking new questions.
Agreed.
They need to be providing new answers.
Agreed.
And even if that seems to be for the sake of trying something new, probably that's a good idea, because we can't just carry on.
Yeah, look, even I was having this discussion with the other great Sohaib from Scotland a bit earlier, who is a member of our team, and we were discussing around how, money and finances and investment, and the conversation we were having in the Islamic finance industry was around these technical products and how they're structured and what have you. But the reality is that we're talking about what's happening in Palestine, and the power and the money and all of that comes and creates the world around us.
The Benjamins, as they say.
The Benjamins. And unfortunately, what we're doing with our Benjamins is we're not actually investing it into our own communities. Like, we're talking about home finance. One of the reasons why we don't have the level of home finance that we should have had is because home finance needs money, because you have this connection between investors and those who need that money, and you have intermediaries. But if the investors are sending it all to the S&P 500, or they're investing in halal things, perhaps, but they're sending it over there and they're not actually directing it in, this kind of circular loop that helps solve our institution's problems, we're kind of looking at our own selves for the problem, right? And the same goes with issues like Palestine and these issues around where we want the world to be. if we're going on these marches or if we're doing various things, but our own pensions supporting companies that are of questionable ethics, then what are we doing? What are we actually doing? Where it really matters, where we're on the wrong side of history.
I think that's why what you're doing is really important. I mean, I know this is probably just a part of what you do, but you need to provide the ethical dimension, the Islamically informed dimension for those who are in those fields. So when, by Allah's grace, they become successful, they know what to do and not to do. Because oftentimes people's path that they chart out for themselves is separate from community guidance. Same thing applies to politics. We had over here a Muslim first minister. Everyone had opinions, but the difficult thing is, as a community, how much do we have a right to speak on this? Where are our political think tanks, for example? We had a first minister who was Muslim before we had a Muslim think tank. We still don't have one. It's just a case of, we need to put our brains together. We need to bring in the relevant information from the different sources and the different skills that we have and support each other. It's solidarity. That's what the Ayatul Bir that we mentioned earlier, it has this aspect of solidarity, that you Muslims, you have to depend on each other. And you have to depend on yourselves, and you have to be there for the others.
And sometimes I think we can be quite pessimistic about everything, right? But I was reflecting that actually, you had these, the four righteous khalifas, and then after that, it seems to me that it's been a bit of a, if you look at it from one lens, a bit of a car crash ever since. And you've had, rulers who've been dodgy and, who've got up to all sorts, and that kind of continues to this day. I guess even the Quran talks about it, right? إِنَّ الْمُلُوكَ إِذَا دَخَلُوا قَرْيَةً أَفْسَدُوهَا وَجَعَلُوا عِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً. Leadership has this, leaders seem to be throughout history of a certain kind, and we've actually very rarely had really ethical leaders. And so in a way, we're not necessarily living through extraordinary times. We're actually living through quite normal times, and I don't know the next step after that. So this is not going to a big observation.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I think a lot of modern life is built upon this exceptionalism and triumphalism, and I think that, again, recent events sort of make you feel like actually civilization is on the verge of collapse. Is that pessimistic? I don't know. It could be a good thing. Yeah. It could be a good thing if the whole thing just goes and then we start again.
I think that's probably where this observation came from, because it's like that it's very natural to think that is happening. But then you actually think, if you compare it to 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and there was the great powers who were colonizing in Africa and Americas, there's always something going on.
Numerous genocides have taken place. It's just a different time where you weren't seeing the whole thing on your screens. I guess it is showing us that times haven't changed, and we just need to go back to the drawing board.
There's a poem attributed to Shafi'i, "Na'ibu zamanuna wal aibu fina, wa ma li zamanina aibun siwana." We could probably carry on for ages, because I think we're both quite happy to just carry on chatting away. But we probably should wrap up. What are your final observations that you want to leave our audience with when it comes to attaching yourself to the Quran in a practical way, and then ultimately reflecting and then implementing it?
I would just say, it's much easier than you think. The tools are there. What has been missing is the cultural imperative. You don't have to wait for that to come around. You have to make it happen. You have to change. You have to break the generational trauma. You have to invest in yourself, in your children, in your next generation, and not repeat the same mistakes. Think about everything that we're doing. Like I said, if we were to think about these classes that we set up, how would we end up making a decision? The most important thing is to pronounce the Arabic out loud. I don't think we could defend that decision, honestly. So let's think about how to move forward, and let's be supportive of that. Because what I see is a lot of fear, trepidation, fear-mongering, accusation of having abandoned tradition, etc., etc. No, the tradition is always to read the Quran as a book of guidance and to do our best to act upon its message and its values. You don't have to do it at Quran.com, but if you do, go to Quran.com/calendar. There you can find all the weekly resources. You can hop on at any time, right? So you don't have to join right from after Ramadan, week 1. You can start in week 29, 30, whatever you want, and just join in. It's easy. Once you do what is easy, I hope you will start to think about, where that takes you and how that nurtures you.
Brilliant. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. We'll link this in the description below as well, so you can get straight into it with no excuses. It's been a pleasure and really illuminating, and an honor to have you here. And inshallah, we'll get you back on as well.
Pleasure. We'll get you back up here, inshallah, to Scotland.
I'll be back inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.